Our next presenter will tell us about a fresh case for shopper media. He is James Tenser, storyteller in chief at VSN Strategies. James, take it away.
Thanks, John. It's really good to be back. The lead conference has been a highlight of my year for a number of years, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about my thoughts and interpretations of the retail media trend. The last few months, I've been really digging into some of the issues, and I think there is room for greater clarity and perhaps a little more thoughtful interpretation of the events that are going on. I'm going to try and do that today. And to do that, I'm going to draw on some of the work I have been assembling for CPGmatters over the last several months. So a lot of this information may not be new. We've been seeing a lot of reporting from a variety of experts or so-called experts. I use that phrase advisedly because if that's so, then maybe I'm one of those. I'm going to make a case for the term shopper media because in a way I'm reverting to some terminology I was using quite a number of years ago before we had digital retail media networks. I have a reason for it. You may agree, you may not agree, but I hope it stimulates a fresh kind of thinking about how we look at this fascinating industry sector. There's a few concepts that have emerged from the research I've done in this series of articles in areas where work needs to be done, how brands are best going to reach and influence their audiences and their prospective audiences using retail media, how to manage the money, how to best manage the investments, how to be fair and balanced when it comes to supporting distribution partners across your entire retail partner world, not just the handful of the very largest. And where do you direct this messaging to the best effect? Online, in-store? Is it about conversions at the bottom of the funnel? Is it about new to brand customers at the top and what's in between? I don't have all the answers to this, but I think we can raise some of the important questions and hopefully reveal today how intricate this issue really is going forward. So for starters, let's look at my favorite example of the day. What's going on here? So the more you look when it comes to retail media, the more you see. I took these pictures on Sunday at a retail store here in Tucson, a Safeway. I had gone in there because I remembered seeing these bars, the belt bars on checkouts, advertising Google Pay. But what do we see here? I guess the promotional cycle had shifted, and here's Apple Pay advertising the very same thing. And this is a fascinating little development because these companies, Google nor Apple, they don't sell their products at Safeway, but they want to influence shoppers right at the point of decision about how they will pay for their grocery orders. And they're using one of the oldest in-store retail media channels I've ever known, and that's called indoor media marketing. They have been in existence since 1989, which I would mark as the dawn of shopper media, alongside some other, let's say, renowned platforms like Floor Graphics. We still see some of those occasionally in stores today. The instant coupon machines from Act Media that were at-shelf coupon dispensers. Catalina Marketing, of course, the checkout coupons. The heyday of that way predated digital retailing. There was already an interest in transferring consumer spending from the brands into the retail environment on the premise that it was closer to the point of decision and therefore likely to be a very good return. The retailer wanted some more money that they couldn't get through their trade activities or trade marketing activities. And the brand wanted to influence shoppers. What's fascinating here, though, is we have a service not sold in the store being advertised now. There's a word for this. It's called non-endemic. It's in-store advertising. And part of what we'll unpack today is, what does this really mean? Why is a thing like this happening now? Bounced too fast. So I'd like to talk about the retail media scape. For a long time, I've been citing something called the retail media ecology principle, which states that the store is a communications environment for brand messages. And when I talk about that in presentations, I always like to ask people, what's the most ubiquitous and frequent branding message in the retail store? We're not in an audience where you can raise hands, but the cute answer to that is, of course, package labels. And in fact, there's tremendous investment as brands, isn't there, in making sure the package labels sell the product right at that moment of decision. Interestingly, we're starting to see now another point of decision, which are the trade events that many of us attend. And we're starting to see retail media networks advertising themselves in that environment because they're trying to influence decision makers. Some of you may be attending today. And look at the mix here. We have certain Walmart and Amazon ads, Instacart. These are all some of the largest retail media networks in terms of scale and revenue. And then alongside that, Roundel, which is Target, a little bit in the middle. Red Media from Hy-Vee, a regional but very assertive regional grocer. And then finally, the lower right is Meijer, and that may be a little bit small to read, which is why you're citing it. They're out there trying to sell their product or their solution to brands. They want to attract a share of revenue. And if you're a brand, and we hear this over and over again, making reasonable, rational decisions for each of these is becoming harder and harder. It's a steeper challenge. Which ones merit your attention? It's a question that's hard to answer still. So for context, we're going to look a little bit at the breakout of where shopper media really is happening. And this is a 6-box grid. I've adapted this from the NIQ Executive Guide to Retail Media Mastery. You've probably seen versions of this. I chose this because I helped develop this a couple of years ago when that guide was written. The columns, endemic, that's products sold by the retailer. Non-endemic, products or services not sold by the retailer. And then we have, if you will, the location, 3 broad classes. They're on the site, that's a channel owned by the retailer. They're off the site, that's a paid media site where the retailer has the ability to direct those messages. It could be a social media page, for example, or search. And then the in-store, that's the bottom of the funnel. That's where things are happening to influence the final decision of the shopper. And I've highlighted the 2 quadrants, top left and bottom left, because I think that's where most of the discussion is happening today when it comes to CPG brands. In the own channels, we see display ads, we see sponsored product ads. Typically, this is happening in the context of an online purchase or a loyalty program interaction. It's a way to deliver offers. It's a way to introduce brands. Again, that issue of can we get new to brand buyers is very important, we know, to many of you. And then in the store, and I read this because, remember, I started with this example of a tactic that began before 1990. Digital signs, shelf labels, end caps, kiosks. These have been there a long time. We're seeing more technology involved in this than ever. The apps that people are carrying their phones may be more location aware. They're sampling activities. These are all about the final conversion, final decision, whereas on the site is about awareness. It's about beginning the journey. In-store, however, is a relatively small expenditure compared with on-site, and we're going to look at those numbers a little bit later. Here again, at the risk of being elementary, this funnel is not going to be unfamiliar to you. But just to break it out a little bit, this is greatly simplified. Awareness offsite. In the middle of that funnel, loyalty and intent, very often on site. But that activation is in the store and maybe on site in the case of an online order. It's worth considering there's more than one objective in play simultaneously. And by the way, as I present this, I'm thinking about Brandon Strauss's comments in the previous presentation. He was talking about breaking down the silos that exist between sales, marketing, and retail. I think there's a congruence here in what he said and this activity. These areas are often managed by different groups of people in our brand organizations. And that may be changing, but it doesn't change that easily. At each level, there's also a different metric that's needed or a different set of metrics. Are we looking at return on ad spend or total ROI or incrementality in terms of additional added sales? It's really great to know if these are new to the brand. Can we determine that through our interactions? This is not simple decision making, especially when it's layered onto a world in which we've had decades of trade marketing and other interactions between brands and retailers. So in store, why in store? Well, CPG is happening there, right? We still see 4/5, maybe as high as 84% of food, drug, mass transactions closing in physical stores. It doesn't mean they're not influenced by some kind of online journey or other upper funnel activity, but people come into retail stores most of the time to pick up their purchases. And especially if that's true for frequently repurchased items, which have a certain kind of shopping dynamic. Frankly, it's quite different from products that are purchased infrequently. They're easy to buy online. Many of the Amazon items that are not fast-moving consumer goods come to mind. In terms of grocery products, the FMI's data, that number was reported last fall, said only 6% of grocery items were purchased online in 2023. Well, there's a skew there, isn't there? Now, that doesn't mean that those shoppers were not, that shoppers in store are not influenced by their online interactions. But it's hard to sort this out. It's one of the challenges that retail media practitioners are still having to deal with today. That last moment of truth is only part of the objective. And sometimes things that are easy to measure are harder to prove. So let's take a look again at some of the numbers. This is a recap of some data, slightly updated, that I presented last fall. But the prize is growing. And the number one reason why retailers and Wall Street investment firms love retail media is the margins. As high as 70%, nothing that is sold in the store comes close to that. We're usually looking at low single digits when it comes to the net. This is incredibly attractive to retailers. The idea that they can bring in this extra revenue that is, it's not pure profit, but it's largely profit. And it's worth investing to get there. In total, retail media, and that's inclusive of all the various channels, reached about $55 billion last year, according to eMarketer. They're a pretty good resource for understanding that scale. But only $8.5 billion of this was grocery or retail media networks. And of those, it's a handful of the largest that are capturing the most of it. The forecast for this total market of retail media, some like to call it commerce media, and we'll talk about that distinction in a moment, approaching 100 billion in a couple, 3 years. It depends who you ask. There are different ways of measuring this, what's included. And by the way, this is for the US market only. In-store last year, though, stood at just $370 million. And yet there's a lot of excitement about its growth. And there's a lot of buy-in from grocers, especially 7 and 10 say they wanted to increase their in-store media deployments in a variety of ways, whatever that means. So what do we mean by in-store? Well, it's pretty much a mixed bag. I don't think we have too many instant coupon machines these days anymore. But there's a variety of companies, and we're going to look at a list of them in a moment, that are trying to put messaging mechanisms into retail stores. Screens, interactions with people's devices, kiosks. The item on the right, on the left, excuse me, is a sampling kiosk from Friosk. There's, we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then there are others trying to put together networks, because it's understood that buying these screens individually or one store at a time, or even one regional retailer at a time, adds so much intricacy that it becomes a hindrance for brands. And companies like Fusion Group, and certainly Quad, Grocery TV, Broadsign, companies that come with a digital out-of-home heritage, in some cases, digital signage companies, they all see this as an opportunity, but it's nascent at this point. It's a small number compared to the hype cycle that we've been hearing from the mainstream about retail media. Sorry for bouncing past. There's also some interesting concepts coming up, and I really wanted to highlight these images, because there's ways to deliver the message in the store that are less passive. And I think this is something to watch. The item on the top on the left is a Walmart sentient aisle, it's called, deployment. This is a display setup which includes product sample, or samples aren't right, but demonstration products on the shelf, and screens behind them, which are triggered by interacting with those products. So pick it up and the messaging plays. It's a kind of a passive salesman or salesperson that's able to help a shopper perhaps make a decision between subtly different options in a category. And of course, it's a space in the store that, in this case, Phillips Norelco gets to have some control over, at least for the period of time that they've purchased this access. Lower right, this is not, there's predecessors for this. It goes back a number of years. The image there with the DeWalt power tools in a Lowe's store, that's also a triggered messaging concept from a company called Pick and Watch. They've had more exposure in Europe, but they've done some testing here. Those sample or demonstration units have a small motion sensor attached, so that when a shopper picks up a drill, in this case, to look at it, or a jigsaw, it also triggers the informational video on the screen behind it. It's a very simple tech. Well, I don't want to diminish the inventiveness, obviously, of Pick and Watch, but it was a fairly straightforward idea. A very small device that's able to trigger messaging, and the playing of those messages, and I'm sure this is true in the Walmart example as well, is trackable, is knowable by the brands. We'll know exactly how many interactions we had. We'll know exactly how many views or potential views happen. So that is an understanding of engagement that previously was really confined to the digital realm, where I think we've become accustomed, haven't we, to understanding that when somebody stops and looks at a product or clicks through to more information, that is a metric that we look at the digital side of the retail world. Hasn't been very possible in the retail store. The Caper Cart example, and of course, there's been lots of focus from Instacart. This particular image is from their press release, but it shows a smart shopping cart in a Schnucks supermarket. These were deployed fairly recently, and Instacart, which is trying to build a retail media presence of its own, is using these carts because, again, they not only can deliver information to shoppers in context, but they also capture information about where shoppers go and what messages have been delivered. And since these are automated checkout carts, they can actually connect the dots between the removal of an item on the shelf and placement in the cart, ultimately to the purchase. This is a full funnel kind of, that's not the right word. This is a full transactional kind of view that brands and retailers both can use to help understand the value of these activities. And there's a bunch of networks happening now. This is a example from the investment community, and the Solomon Partners, which is a company that's very interested in the grocery industry and in the merger and acquisition world, especially, put this list together. Not all of these brands were familiar to me, and some of them come from the digital out-of-home world. Vibenomics is audio. Walmart Connect, of course, is included here. PRN Networks, which is a large screen network. Grocery TV, which is a large and aspiring network in grocery stores. All of these networks are after a little piece of your spend. And I looked a little bit at some of the ones that I think are most relevant to CPGs. Pardon me for that. This group is interesting. And in our recent article, we actually kind of did a little bit of a laundry list of these. So what do we have in these 15? Vibenomics, which is an in-store audio heritage. They've got, and I'm going to read a few stats for you, 1.2 billion monthly shopper visits, 25,000 retail locations. Ideal by Design House. They have developed a dynamic in-store digital store circular that's displayed on shoppers' digital devices. And they've got about 18,000 locations, 5,000 retail banners. Grocery TV, as we spoke about, they claim 234 million monthly shopper visits, 4.9 billion impressions each month, 84 million unique customers, 32,000 displays across the United States, more than 5,000 retail locations. They're starting to have some scale, and scale is an important aspect for us to discuss. Of course, Instacart ads, they cover 85,000 stores and are trying to do more of the cart implementations that we saw earlier. Shop to Cook, been around a while. They're really a recipe kiosk, and they are in about 1,200 locations. Freosk, which is a automated sampling platform in a number of interesting places, including Sam's Clubs, ShopRite, and Fresh Grocer. It's about 1,300 stores. It's a way of making sampling happen without a human being on the case. And PRN Networks, a long history in this business. They're owned by Stratacache these days. They're really a digital signage company, and they're across a variety of retail stores. Quad's a newcomer on the scene. They're actually, you know them better as a company that may print the retail circulars that you interact with or even advertise in. They're building out a retail screen network. I could go on, but the point being here is that we have a variety of different approaches to the in-store piece. And there's a lot of interest in this, but it's worth reminding that by comparison, this is still a relatively small sector. And it's not clear to me how big a slice of the monetary pie this is going to capture, at least not yet. As I said earlier, we're sort of at the end of the beginning here. This is a sector where shopper media, I think, has a lot of potential that is yet to be realized. And do these all survive and prosper? It's hard to say. I'm not sure that they can. Everyone's wants a slice of this. And as a brand, once again, the decision comes back over and over again. How do we decide what portion of our attention and decision-making capacity do we put towards each of these? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's probably something that brand marketers struggle with on a daily basis. So what happens in store? Well, it's still price promotions more than anything else. That's the way that we finally achieve the activation that we're desiring in the store. This came from a study from Grocery TV, so it's, I'm sure, skewed to their own implementations. And it's interesting to compare this to what we traditionally know as trade promotion offers, whether they're broad or personalized. That's been one of the justifications for trade promotion for a long time, is it is the final action, the thing that we can actually measure. Why? Because we can look at the point of sale and say, yep, a sale happened. But there are a lot of stages to this. This makes sense at the bottom of the funnel. Interesting, this particular chart asked about the preference of shoppers to the messaging that could happen in store on digital signs. And they care about price. This is not news to most of us. So I'm bringing this back up again. This also I presented last fall, because the Cadent Consulting Group does the best job, I think, of understanding where CPG marketing spend is applied. So I dug this one back out, and it's worth noting that marketing spending, almost 3/4 of all the spend, is going through retailers today, and that's a blend of trade promotion and shopper marketing, and now increasingly retail media. These guys are, if they're not already on your follower list, you should keep track of what these guys do. They have for decades, the founders of this firm, been, I think, one of our best resources at understanding this. So trade promotion is still the king here when it comes to the largest. That's that top trace on the chart. When it comes to the largest share of spending, but media growth is squeezing the funds, and this leads to some interesting conversation about how retailers and brands plan together going forward. What we also see is that traditional advertising, that's the gray line in the right-hand chart, is continuing to be a smaller share. That's not news to any of you either. It is those dollars that retailers hope most will be transferred into their retail media revenue streams. It's not quite always that simple, but as it's turning out, the conversation is getting more complex. That leads to another problem or another challenge in our conversation. And we devoted one of the articles last fall to this question: is the fair share matter? And as many of you know, if you are on the brand side, it has been not just traditional, but although it has been a tradition, but it also has been legally influenced that investment in trade marketing needed to be proportional to the size of the retailer. Excuse me a moment. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when we invest our marketing funds, it's not appropriate to provide disproportionate advantage to certain customers just because they're larger. But in fact, those investments need to be in proportion to the amount of sales that they generate for us. And that's not just true for pricing, direct pricing discrimination, but also for promotional allowances, because those, and services, because those amount to price advantage for those retailers. Now, the world's not perfect, but for quite a long time, with the umbrella of the Robinson-Patman Act, we've had a pretty good record in our industry of fairness and balance. It means that the amount of promotional dollars for a case of product at a large grocer would be in alignment at a smaller grocer. I don't know if I'm explaining that clearly. The point of this is to make sure that smaller and regional competitors have a fair shot at serving their customers. And ultimately, the reason behind this is to make sure that consumers also get a fair share of pricing, because the obvious issue is that if certain large retailers have too much advantage, over time they could use that leverage to control pricing. This is coming up these days at the Federal Trade Commission. There have been a couple of instances in the last year, one with PepsiCo and another with Southern Glazer Wines and Spirits, that suggests that they were offering advantaged pricing to certain retailers. And the FTC has brought matters about this at the end of last year. We'll see in the current political climate how far those go. But what's notable there is that they called out this practice. One of the problems in retail media, I'm going ahead too fast. One of the problems for retail media is that a relatively small number of the largest retail media networks seem to be gobbling up the lion's share of the investment. And brands are, we understand, struggling to master each of those platforms and environments in a way that allows them to make empirically based, strong decisions about their retail media investment. For some of the ones that we looked at earlier that are a little bit smaller or regional, think about a Red Network at Hy-Vee or a Meyer or any number of other important regional retail partners. Are they even able to command a fair share of attention from your brands? Anecdotally, we're hearing it's difficult. It is difficult, but there is a need to consider this now in the joint business planning process where it exists. I think this is a complicated problem. And in the research we did this past year, we haven't found a lot of answers. I'm aware that the National Grocers Association is concerned about this because they represent a lot of the smaller and independent retailers. There's a little bit discussion also at the FMI. The statements, though, have lagged behind the conversations. And we think, or I think, that brands are going to be challenged to make sure that they support their products across their entire distribution networks. And if they fail to do so, then they're I was going to use the word condemning, but they're possibly allowing some of their important retail partners, who collectively add up to as much as half of your product distribution, to have a operational disadvantage, a cost disadvantage that could hurt your business. Ultimately, in the end, you need the power in this business is distribution power. And in order to make that happen, you need to support all your partners in proportion with their scale. So this is me, I think, on the soapbox a little bit. I think this is an issue that has not been addressed adequately yet. Now, this leads to an interesting conversation. And I'm sharing this because it just struck me this week about this distinction between trade marketing and retail media. And I'm going to take a moment. I think I should read this quote out loud because it's kind of interesting. This comes from the Middlemen podcast, one of several worthwhile commentary podcasts that are focused on retail media and related issues. So what do these guys say? For 5 years, Wall Street has been pressing retailers to say that retail media is this new thing, but not an incremental thing, not the same as trade. That makes sense because I thought also that retailers would, you'd have to pry the retail media dollars from their cold, dead hands to move them into retail media. Who wants to see a dollar move from one pocket to another? On the retail side of things, that seems intuitively unlikely. But these guys feel that, in fact, the folks who control trade at retail, they're likely to end up consuming retail media. And why? Because trade has this thing that's more important than just the data, it's relationships. Now, this is a provocative comment. It's also unique. I've not seen anyone else in the retail media world say this. I think, if anything, we've heard the opposite, that retail media looks at that big number we just looked at earlier from the Cadent data and say, boy, the biggest chunk of funds out there is in trade. Let's get that for us. And that's a good thing if you're in an intermediary in the retail media world. It's not such a grand thing if you're a retailer and all you're seeing is added complexity and yet a shift of dollars into a different role, where the trade marketing is still the backbone of retailers. In fact, it could be argued it may account for more than 100% of net profits for some retailers. So what we are hearing, though, is that more joint business planning meetings at some retailer accounts are starting to address the full breadth of shopper media investment. That's including trade, it's including retail media, it's including any other activities at the top of the funnel or the mid-funnel point, so that brands and retailers together can try to create a thoughtful kind of approach to putting the right dollars in the right place. Because in the end, what matters are more sales and more profits for both partners. I know that's a little idealistic, but we're seeing less separate and parallel conversations. It appears where in some cases the brand is selling their product to the retailer and offering trade incentives to do so. And in a separate room, the retailer is offering their retail media network to the brand and asking for funds from the brand because of some purported benefits that will yield to them. It does make sense that those conversations should be blended, but it does not make things simple, that's for sure. For fun, I went back to ancient times and dredged up this little chart about the ROI pyramid, because in the end, this is what we're talking about, right? How do we get a return from these investments? So this I presented at the Digital Signage Expo in 2009. And here we're looking at the kinds of messages and comparing frequency and ad value, all right? So opportunities to see, which online are clicks, but it happens in stores as well. They're passive, they're passed by. This is where you kind of get the cost per thousand kind of metrics. Views in an online, or this is now we're getting to the mid-funnel, but in an online or digital environment, well, views are knowable. In the store, it's not been so easy to know that a product or a message has been seen, although that's beginning to change. But online, we know how many people saw a page, how many people saw a featured product offer or a sponsored product offer. This information is knowable. If they actually click on it, that's due, right? Is a punch through of some kind, look for information, expanding an opportunity that's higher in value in theory, as we, again, consider how we're advancing through that pyramid. And then finally, an actual purchase. And there's something beyond that for brands too, is can we use this to support loyal behavior? That's kind of nirvana, it always has been. How do we not only attract new shoppers, new buyers to our product, but engage them in a satisfying way that leads them to prefer our brand and buy them on a repeated basis? This is what we're all after. It is, as often said in the world of customer relationship management, it's a lot less expensive to keep a shopper than it is to find a new one. Interestingly, and this also kind of predates the retail media world, or it was at the dawn really of some of the sponsored products things that we saw commonly at Amazon and Google. This is how we were talking about it then. I can tell you, I had in my mind screens. This was the Digital Signage Expo. What happens when we put messages in the store? Still relevant today, I believe. Okay, now back to that problem. Are there just too many networks? And we've seen from another place, a number of places, this is from Trade Desk, which is one of the intermediary players here in the world. Almost 6 in 10 US advertisers don't want to work with more than about 4 retail data partners. There's 200 of them, by the way, right now in the US. 70% of grocers are increasing their deployments. They want a share of this. So this is an interesting little dilemma, I think. How can both these things be true at the same time? And I'd love if we had a chance to do a poll here of 100 retail media people at brands. I'd want to know how many are you dealing with, or how do you get to so many of those? If we're looking for fair and balanced spending, if we want to make sure that our distribution network is supported proportionally everywhere, yet we don't have the bandwidth to make individual decisions, by the way, on platforms which work differently beyond more than a few of the largest retailers, this seems to be a dilemma that's not gone away yet. How are we going to get there? Well, the answer appears to be there's a whole bunch of intermediaries out there that are trying to provide us with the answer. And they come in a couple of different flavors or buckets. I just put this list together. It's not comprehensive at all. But all these hands are reaching for the pie. They're all in the middle, trying to get paid for putting audiences together for brands. The in-store networks, we spoke about some of them earlier. There's this thing we call demand-side platforms. I think that's probably not new terminology to many of you. Trade Desk, ad tech. By the way, there's a list of probably 30 or 40 of these. 35 about. Um, they're all buying platforms for media. Find an audience, they allow you to use digital process to buy advertising. Um, Programmatic marketplaces, they're similar but different, but they allow you to use programmatic tools, which are common on the digital world, to try and find audiences. Um, this stuff is complicated to use, so the agencies step in, right? And this is just a partial list of ad agencies, all of whom are going after the retail digital media world. What's their motivation? Well, they've been making a lot of their money on, linear TV media. I mean, media is the big revenue generator for these agencies. If they see money shifting from television and cable toward retail media networks, you can bet they're going to follow, and try to make sure that they retain some control over that spend. So they're all there very, very very actively participating. And then finally, wholesalers and distributors. This is the intermediary group that potentially helps brands reach the collective of independent and smaller retailers across the country. And they have an interesting role because in many cases, these wholesalers and distributors have already lots of experience in redirecting trade marketing investment to their client retailers. They take a piece of the action for doing this, but it enables brands to put forth a trade program and then see that it gets distributed in proportion to retailers all over underneath their umbrellas. And this is an interesting issue. A couple of these companies, Spartan Nash, CNS, Unify, have actually been on podiums recently talking about what they're trying to do to create retail media opportunities for their member retailers. And so they can consolidate those audiences on behalf of brands. They're going to take a little piece for it. Taken all in aggregate, though, this is a complex landscape. And at this point, there's a lot of pontification out there by experts who want to claim there's one way to go. But very often when you kind of get underneath the hood of their commentary, they're really thinking about a few of the largest retail media networks, and they're not as focused on all of these other mechanisms. As a brand, it's a tough decision here. How many of these do we interact with, and who in our organizations does? Is this part of a joint business planning process? Is this part of something new that still needs to be built within our organizations? To my knowledge, there's a lot of interest in how do we optimize that? How do we use automation? God knows, do we use artificial intelligence to navigate all of this? In the end, if we understand that traditional media are not delivering in the way they used to, and we need to find people new to the brand, we need to stimulate interest along the funnel, and ultimately conversions at the point of decision, the point of sale. How are we going to use all of this? I think this sounds like a headache to me. And despite the amazing amount of, let's say, promotional communications about this industry, I'm going to go back to my earlier point. I think we're at the end of the beginning here. I think we're just starting to figure out what this landscape needs to be like. So my top insights here. Have I given you the answers to things? I don't really think so, because I don't claim to have the answers. But there's some things to know as this develops, as we move into the next chapter of shopper media. And by the way, in this conversation, I focus entirely on the retailer side of things. There are other so-called commerce media networks out there also that are, I think, banking organizations and entertainment platforms and others that are all also looking for a share of this digital spend. But for CPG brands interacting with food, drug, mass, probably C-store, it's a digital and in-store proposition. And I think the entire strategy has to be considered together. As I think we've demonstrated today, it's got a lot of layers. It's challenging to implement. It's hard to measure. And it's hard to understand what success means. And I said there are too many intermediary players. That's a value judgment on my part. There are many, and I have a feeling that a few are going to tend to rise to the top that are that have the best utility, that have that simplify the answers. That's clearly uh, a, an area of complexity now that I think cries out to be simplified. Most retailers, I don't mean most retail dollars, most of your retailer distributors are struggling to capture a fair share of the spend. And I think there's a belief that they should be receiving from each of your brands retail media investment that has been proportioned to the amount of product they move for you. It's not an unreasonable starting point in the conversation. There are practical reasons, though, why we all know this is hard to accomplish. 5, something that will help will be more standards, right? And there are groups that are trying to work on, well, what is an ad unit here? What is a measurement standard? What is success, right? I mean, is it return on ad spend, or is it total ROI, or is it net new shoppers? What are the results of success, and what's the unit that we're selling? There's some good work from the ANA, advertising. Pardon me for not remembering the acronym. There's work going on here to try and do this. Whether it leads to better practices, I'd say I'm hopeful. But I think, yeah, there again, we're at the end of the beginning. We're just starting to even test out what those standards are. And then finally, and I say this with humility, most of the experts you'll meet here are exaggerating how much they understand. And so you should regard them with some skepticism, understand where they're, who they're serving in their communications. You should feel the same way about me. I don't know that I have every answer right here. What I've been doing for the last 6 months is trying to uncover the questions. And it seems that the more I ask, the more I find. Some of them have some parts of it right. There's lots of discussion about what should be a good result for a brand from a retail media investment. That's an important conversation you need to be part of. The question is, can the results justify the complexity that you take on? And if you choose not to participate with certain retail partners, what is your alternate approach in terms of how you spend the money? For example, how do you support your brands? That, to me, is the core, most foundational question for CPGs. How do you best support your brands and drive on your goals in this somewhat chaotic and complex environment? I think more of those answers are yet to come than we actually have today. And with that, if you still have any thoughts, I'd love to take some questions if we can.
Yeah, we have a couple questions that came in the chat box, James. Number one, where should CPG brands direct their shopper media messaging to best effect? Online, offline, and in-store?
I guess the answer is yes. Yeah, how do you not consider those aspects of the customer experience here? It doesn't make it simple because the methods and the means are different in each of those. If your product is being sold through a retailer that has an online presence and, importantly, a digital loyalty app, that's going to be one of the places where your messaging needs to be in correct proportion delivered. It's especially important when it comes to attracting new to brand shoppers, which everybody covets so much. By the way, offline is a place for that too. And I think offline is less well understood, but the idea that a retailer would use a variety of media channels that it can direct your messages to, that and again, social media comes to mind. That's not the only type here, but that's a necessary way to spread the wider net. If you're trapped within the walled garden of the retailer, then the opportunity to add new shoppers, new consumers of your product is going to be limited by that. And you can't really offset that by interacting with a great many separate shopper media networks. So offline is part of this. I think for brands, you can't focus on one to exclusion of the other. In-store feels more like trade. I'm thinking about the Middleman podcast comment, but there are certainly some differences now because there's different message delivery there than trade marketing used to provide for. Face it, it's not just price and display anymore, right? There's also messaging platforms. Increasingly, I think we're going to see electronic shelf labels used to deliver certain messages. We're going to see what was the comment? I think it was I think Brandon mentioned that more than half of shoppers are walking in the store now with their phones on. They're interacting in somehow. Maybe they're checking prices or they're looking at their loyalty app. So that's a channel that is sort of in the wild here. So there's no simple way to say, well, pick one, it's the best. I think in order to do this well, you need to have an awareness, a full funnel awareness is the term that some people need to use. And in each layer or step along that funnel, there's going to be some different tactics and means that are necessary. This is why this is not for chumps, right? This is not for wimps. This kind of work. It's complicated and it requires expertise. I think that's still being developed.
Alrighty, next question that came in. How can brands best balance and evaluate their shopper media investments?
That's a work in progress, of course. I think first one needs to understand what are the metrics that we're seeking. And it's one thing to say, well, we got during a promotional period, we got a certain lift in the store. That's a lot like the trade marketing thing, isn't it? Or a coupon drop or something like that. The means are more sophisticated. They're more digital. Hey, there's nothing like sales, right, to prove that something worked. But it can possibly be misleading in terms of the effectiveness of your retail media investment if you just focus on that, because price is going to always create lift. It does not necessarily mean that other brand objectives are being served. That said, at other layers of the funnel, I think one needs to have different metrics. How well did we get the message to people through our off-site activities? Can we identify interactions that are known to be new to our brand? Again, that is kind of nirvana for a lot of folks I'm hearing. How do we grow the brand? I think the methods for measuring also are going to vary with the platform you're on. So if you're using the Walmart Connect platform or the Amazon platform or Google's, there's going to be certain tools built in, and they're useful. If you're talking to one of the regional important partners, here's an interesting example. Some of the convenience store chains are putting big digital signage deployments out there. What's the payback from that? Well, first of all, you need to insist on having some kind of result, reportable result, if you're going to invest in that. But furthermore, when you make a allocation decision, where do we put a dollar? Understanding that return in that kind of environment and that kind of messaging, you may be comparing that with something dramatically different. Let's face it, at Circle K, you're not perhaps looking that hard at their digital online interactions. It's a different kind of environment. So the answer ultimately about how do we measure is, I think you have to have not one, North Star metric, but you need to have a collection of these that are situationally appropriate.
Okay, here's the last question and the best question. Can brands even hope to maintain fairness and balance across their crucial distribution partners?
Well, first of all, that's a really good question. It's really provocative. Gosh, I think there are consequences if they don't, but I think the challenge is enormous. What I hear anecdotally is that this is hard for brands, people that have, um, let's call it uh, uh, partnering intent, that actually care about those distribution channels, that want them to be healthy, because once again, distribution power is market power. You want your product. What was Asa Chandler's comment at Coca-Cola? Everywhere somebody's thirsty. That goes back 120 or 140 years. Well, if you don't have as many distribution points, are you going to make up for that difference by driving more sales at some of the biggest networks? I'm not sure if that's realistic. And are the shoppers that walk into the largest retailer we have, which is Walmart, are they completely a duplicate of people that are at, however many tens of thousands of independent retail stores we have? Um, and the answer is some will overlap and some don't. So if you care about reaching your whole market, and by the way, if you're backing away from television advertising or some other means that potentially can reach the whole country, the entire consumer base, then it's kind of important to keep those relationships healthy. Now, how do you accomplish that? I think the methods are being invented. I think it's important to talk to the wholesalers and the distributors because they're trying to figure this out. Pay attention to the advice and counsel from the trade associations that represent retailers. They're trying to help puzzle this through also. They're political bodies by nature, so they're going to be careful. Um, do I think the Federal Trade Commission is going to come in and mandate? In the present environment, I don't know if they have the bandwidth themselves. There may be a few um, uh, cases like the two that I mentioned that are designed to kind of make people thoughtful. But in fact, I don't think we're going to see micromanagement from the regulatory side for this. What matters is if you have a product and you care about reaching the entire marketplace, then you need to devote at least a portion of your, let's call it mind width, to thinking about how you're going to serve those groups. The question of what's really fair and equitable is always going to be subjective, but what is important is that there's a representation for those retail partners to the best of our ability as brand advocates, that we recognize the value that they provide. The alternative is to see a condensation of the retail environment to many fewer retail entities over time. And there's already quite a bit of pressure on merger and acquisition in the grocery trade, to some extent, even in convenience store. And there are folks in Wall Street who would love to see that happen. What matters, I think, here is intent. It matters that in the context of your interactions with those entities, is that the discussion is not it's not a taboo topic. Talk about it. The retailers may have some ideas. The wholesalers may have ways to make this possible. They may say, if we're already managing trade funds for those retailers for you, maybe if we help pass along some of these retail media or shopper media dollars to them, maybe they feel it's in their interest to be negotiable about the terms of that. I don't know if those conversations have taken place yet, but I believe they should.
Okay, well, thank you, Jamie. That was really interesting, and it's very interesting to see how this whole area will develop in the future. So, if the audience has further questions and want to connect with Jamie in the future, you can contact him at jtenser@vsnstrategies.com. His email is on the screen. So, thank you again, Jamie. Appreciate it.
A great pleasure to be here again, John. Thank you very much.